So in this video, we're going to take a look at Docker. What is Docker? How does Docker work? As well as what are some use cases. Then I'm going to show you how we can be able to containerize a Node.js application and update our Node.js application and synchronize our changes inside of our Docker container. Then I'm also going to show you Docker volume, which how we can be able to persist our database. Then we're going to talk about how we can be able to run multiple containers using Docker Compose, which is something that I forgot to talk about in my past videos. So if you do want to follow along, please make sure to have your Docker application set up in your local machine. You can install Docker Desktop for Mac or Windows or Linux. And if you do want to show support to this channel, please consider subscribe to this channel. And we're very close to hitting 1,000 subscribers on this channel. And of course, the timestamp is in the description of this video, so feel free to jump to any section that you prefer. So let's begin by talking about what is Docker. Docker is an open source platform that automates the deployment and scaling and managing our applications using containerizations. So containerization basically encapsulates our applications and their dependencies into containers, ensuring consistency across different environments. And having a consistent environment really improves the productivity across team members, since each team members can be able to test, develop, and deploy their application on their machine without dealing with the environment issue. And it also makes it easier for horizontal scaling, since we can be able to easily spin up a new container using the instruction that we define in a Docker file. And for our CI/CD pipeline, we can be able to use Docker again to spin up a new container for each stage, like testing stage, staging, QA, or production stage. And each stage will have a consistent environment based on the Docker file instructions. And Docker basically contains three things: Docker file, Docker image, and Docker container. So Docker file is basically a script of instructions to build our Docker image, and Docker image is basically a standalone application that includes everything we need to run a piece of software or instance of our software. And Docker container is basically a running instance of a Docker image, providing an isolated environment for our application. So here you can see this is how we can be able to use Docker. So Docker, we have registry, which basically stores all the images like the Redis image, Ubuntu images, and so many more images. And user can be able to pull image down to their local machine and be able to build it, be able to run it, and be able to pull other images down to their local machine as well. And when they try to use the Docker keyword, they're interacting with the Docker host, which in this case, it uses Docker daemon to be able to perform operations on images and containers. All right, so once we have our Docker installed on our Mac machine, what we're gonna do is we're gonna open our Docker. And here you can see we have our Docker desktop application open. And right now we don't have any images, we don't have any containers, we don't have any volumes right now. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna open our VS Code. And right now I have a code repository which already created. So the link of this code repository is in the video description. Feel free to download that and play around. And here you can see right now inside of our code repository, we have a simple Node server application, which renders some static HTML, which we also have a persistence layer, which stores our data in a SQL database. So what we're gonna do now is we're going to first build our Docker file, which provides the instruction to build our Docker image. So we're going to click on create a new file inside of our current directory. So we're going to name it Docker file. So we're going to first build our image from a Node version 18 Alpine, and then we're going to set the working directory of that container. Then we're going to copy all the files and folders from the source, which is inside of our current directories, to the working directories inside of the container. Then we're going to run the yarn install production, which installs our application. Then we're going to run our index.js file. And we're going to expose the port 3000, which we can be able to interact with. So then once we have our Docker file, we're going to build our Docker image. So what we're going to do here is we're going to run docker build -t, which basically is setting the name of that Docker image to be getting started. Lastly, we're going to have a dot at the end, which tells Docker that it's going to look for the Docker file in our current directory. So what we're going to do now is we're going to first build this file. And once we finish building, what we're going to do is we're going to say Docker images, and you can see that we have an image created. So what we're going to do now is we're going to come to the Docker desktop, and you can see that inside of our images, we have one image that is currently in use, which has the same Docker image ID as what we have in the terminal. Okay, so once we have our image created, what we're going to do now is we're going to run our Docker container. So here you can see I'm going to run Docker run in a detached mode, and we're going to publish the mapping of the ports. So that's going to be our local port, which is going to be 3000. And then this port is the container port, which in this case is exposed to 3000. So we can, if we're going to change this to, for example, 3001, then we're going to change it to 3000 3001 as well. And then we're going to specify the name of the Docker image. In this case, the image name is getting started. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this, and this is going to be our container ID. And here you can see we have a container that's running at port 3000. And if we were to click on the container, you can see this is the logs, and it's currently listed on port 3000. So if we go to a browser and then we refresh on local 3000, you can see that we have our current application running. So we have task 1, task 2. So you can see that if we refresh, we can be able to persist the data, and you can see that it uses SQLite database at this directory, which persists our data in there. So now let's take a look at how we can be able to make some changes inside of our application. So for example, let's say if I want to change the title of the page from to-do app to something else, for example, inside of our index.html. So I'm going to change the to-do app. And then if I save it and I try to build the image again, and once I build the image, I want to be able to run our container again. And you can see that I'm getting an error because right now I have already a container running. So if I were to do docker ps, I can be able to see that I have already a container of this image running. So what we're going to do is we're going to kill this container. So we're going to say docker stop for this container. We're going to provide a container ID. So once we have our Docker container is removed, what we're going to do now is we're going to run our container again. So now we have our new container running. So what we're going to do is we're going to say docker ps, and you can see that we have a new container running 8 seconds ago. And now if I were to refresh our page, you can see that we have our page title changed. And also you notice here that the data that we added is already gone, because once we stop our container, the data that we have inside of that old container is gone. And to resolve this issue, we can be able to use something called Docker volume, which basically persists our data outside of the container. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a volume while we run our container. So first, let's do Docker ps, and we can be able to see that currently our Docker is running. So what we're going to do now is we're going to shut it down. So we're going to say docker stop. We're going to specify the Docker ID, and then we're going to say docker ps, and you can see that right now there's no more containers running. So once we have our container removed, we're going to create a volume. So we're going to say docker volume create, and this is going to be the name of our volume. And once we have our Docker volume created, we're going to say docker volume ls. You can see that these are the volumes that we have inside of our local machine. And you can see currently we only have one volume. So then we're going to run our Docker container and specify some values that we want to mount. So first we're going to mount the volume. So in this case, we're going to provide the source, and the source is going to be to do db, which is the name of the volume. And then the target is going to be the path of the database location inside of the container. And if we were to look at our previous container logs, you can see that it says here that using SQLite at this location. So we've specified that this is the target path of the data that we want to persist. So what we're going to do now is we're going to run our container, and then if we were to do docker ps, and we have a new Docker container running. So now we have our new container running. What we're going to do is we're going to add some data, and then we're going to shut down our Docker container, and then we're going to run it again and see if we can be able to persist it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to stop this container, and then we're going to run our container again. And if we were to refresh, you can see that our data still exists. All right, so now what I want to talk about is how we can be able to run our application in separate containers. So right now at this moment, we're using one container to run both of our to-do application and also our persisting layer, which stores our data. But right now, if I want to run this in multiple containers and run at the same time where they communicate with each other, what we're going to do is we're going to create a network. So one way we can do this is we can be able to do it in a terminal. Here you can see I wrote a command. Of course, this command is a little bit complicated. But what I'm trying to get here is that we're trying to first create a network where those two containers that's going to communicate under the same network. And then what we're going to do is we're going to provide some environment variables, and then the command that it's going to run, and it's going to run the MySQL container as well as the to-do application container. But the other way we can do this is we can be able to use Docker Compose, which we can be able to define a file like this and be able to allow user to edit. And all we need to do is once we define this, we can just need to do Docker Compose up, and this will basically run our Docker Compose file that we define inside of our directory. So right now you can see inside of our compose.yaml, we have a couple of things defined. So inside of services, we have two containers. One is app and the other one is MySQL. And here you can see inside of app, we have our image, which is our base image, just like how we define inside of our Docker file. And then we also have our command that will run, And we basically install our current package, and then we do yarn run dev. Then we also have the ports mapping, as well as the working directory, and also the volume. So here's the file path for our current directory. And then this is the file path inside of the application. And then we also define the environment variables that we're going to use inside of our application. The other container is the MySQL. And here you can see we have image defined, as well as the volume, and then also the environment variable. Now, one of the common questions that you might be asking is, here you can see we have a command that starts this container, but where's the command to start the MySQL container? So to answer that question, basically what happened is that when we don't specify the command attribute, it will basically use the command attribute from this base image. So it will use the default command from the MySQL 8.0, and it will basically start up our SQL server inside of this container based on this image. And the other question that you might be having is why we are keeping the volumes defined outside of the service. So this volume is defined outside of the service because this volume is going to be persist throughout all the containers in this Docker Compose. So basically, once the containers shut down or one of the containers stopped, this data will still exist. And the volumes that were created inside of these containers and will not be shared across other containers. This is basically bind mounts. What it means is that anything that we change inside of our host application, like what we change inside of our local machine, will reflect on the directory of the /app, which is this container. So the container will sync the changes that we made inside of our local machine. So now what I want to do is I want to test this. So right now you can see if I do Docker PS, right now we don't have any containers running. So if I want to spin up our Docker containers, right? So two of the containers all together, we're going to run Docker Compose up in a detached mode. So we're going to run this. So right now you can see what's happening is it pulls the MySQL image and then it creates the network. And we're going to start our MySQL and MyApp containers. And here, if we were to go to our GUI, you can see we have getting started. So here you can see we have two containers running inside of this. And we can be able to click this and you can see we can be able to see the two different containers logs. And it seems like all of them are running successful. So let's go to our application, refresh. We can be able to see our application started. So I'm just going to enter some data. So what we're going to do now is also we want to take a look at MySQL server to see if all the data exist. So the container ID, if we were to do Docker PS, so we can be able to see that we have two containers. And this is the Docker container ID for the MySQL. So what we're going to do now is we're going to run MySQL server in interactive mode. So if we were to enter this, and we're also going to enter the password. In this case, the password is defined inside of the compose YAML. And so inside of our compose YAML, in this case, it's called secret. So we're going to type in secret. And here you can see I'm inside of the MySQL database. And here I can be able to run show database to see all the database that we have. And then show tables to see that all the tables that we have. So here you can see we have a to-do items. And then what we're going to do is we're going to query all the items that we have. So in this case, we have 5 items, just like how we have inside of our application. So if I were to make one more items, add it. So if I add one more items, and then if I want to run the query again, you can see we have 6 items. So you can see that we can be able to interact. So you can see that right now we can be able to interact with 2 containers at the same time, and 2 containers are interacting with each other. We want to exit, we just type in exit. This will exit the SQL interactive session. So then if we want to shut down our Docker Compose, all the containers, then we can just do Docker Compose down, and this will shut down all of our containers all together. And if we were to look at Docker PS, you can see that there are no containers running. So to summarize everything, in this video, we went over what is Docker and how does Docker work, as well as what are some use cases that we can be able to use Docker for. Then we also talk about how we can be able to containerize our application by first writing a Docker file, which build our Docker image, as well as a use Docker image to run our container. And then we also containerize our Node.js application and update our Node.js application and synchronize the changes inside of our Docker container. Then we also talk about how we can be able to use Docker volume to persist our data so that we can be able to still persist our data inside of our local machine. So then we talk about how we can be able to separate our Node.js and our MySQL database into a separate containers and run those 2 containers together using Docker Compose under the same network. So that's it for this video, and thank you for watching. If you like this content, please consider like this video and subscribe to this channel.